Okay, so let's just move smartly on. Just a bit of kind of personal bio. I've pretty much worked in data centers all my life. I've seen, the data center industry in its boom and bust eras. Pretty much it's been in a boom since 2006 onwards, growing at a phenomenal rate, and we all know why. Those words AI, or those letters AI come into it. I've been around with the dot-com boom and bust, and so it's been interesting times, and I think we're in for even more interesting times. And I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective today around what I see as what the impacts are going to be around data centers. So if you take a look at this chart here, you can see that, this is probably out of date. This was at the end of last year. There's phenomenal demand being generated by AI out there. There's people, everyone from school children to people in businesses using AI, and it's having a huge impact globally. And obviously, we mustn't forget that at the end of the day, AI comes from our data centers. So let's take a look at that. So I want to, first of all, apologies for those of you who already know all about Gen AI and what it consists of. But let's start firstly by kind of breaking it down. It's usually in 3 stages. So you've got the model creation, where it's going out and it's sucking all this data in. Most people are aware of the large language models, where it's building up these huge databases of information. And then in the tuning phase, it's tokenizing and creating associations and semantics between different tokens to try and knit everything together. And then finally, we've got inferencing, where when you're at your terminal and you're typing in a command, create me a picture of Donald Trump on a horse, so therefore it create you that. If you want it to create your report for the board, it will do that for you. So that's the inference inside. Okay? And to put a bit of context around this, well, it's no surprise, since every conference I've been to in the last year or two is discussing that data centers are vast consumers of energy. And many of the figures that you'll get quoted are estimates, right? That nobody really knows for sure. We can only look in retrospect, and a lot of those retrospective figures are often, a year, 2 years out of date. So they're the best things that we can work from in order to try and look forwards and see what's going to be happening in the future. And a lot of that is because there are a lot of commercial reasons for confidentiality with some of the data center providers. They don't really want you to know what they're consuming. They don't want you to know how they're consuming it. So we have to try and kind of look under the hood a little bit and grope around in the dark to try and get the information that we need. And it might surprise you to know that kind of at the low end of estimates for how much energy we're using at the moment. In terms of, if you look at the 2022 figures, using as much energy as Australia as a whole, and at the high end of estimates, it could be more than France, which is the 10th largest consumer of electricity in the world. So these are not small numbers, and we have to take that into account when we think about how data centers will develop over the next decade. Now, a lot of that is a huge demand on the national grids. Okay, because at the end of the day, most of the data, pretty much 99% of all data centers take power from the national grid. There may be a few, particularly in the US, where they're considering taking their own on-site generation in order to develop data center footprint, but pretty much everybody's having to take from the local grid. And the only reason that things aren't worse than they currently are is because of Cummings' law. Now, if you're familiar with Cummings' law, it states that the energy efficiency of computers doubles roughly every 18 months. And if you take that versus Moore's law, which states that processing power doubles every 18 to 24 months, if you look at the growth, and I'll show you some of this, but if you look at the growth of electricity demand, it's actually not quite as bad as it could be if it wasn't for Cummings' law and Moore's law. Well, actually, the IT's using less power than it possibly could have done had it stayed at the same efficiency levels. Now, the European data center market is growing at a combined annual growth rate of nearly 8%, okay, by 2029. Now, that's a formidable amount of growth, right? Because that's growth on growth. And for most enterprises, if you think about it, data center strategy is a 5-year exercise. So if you're catering for Gen AI, which has only been around for a couple of years, how have enterprises shifted towards understanding what portfolio they need in the near future and further on, when actually they haven't done they haven't worked those kind of numbers within the last strategy period? And if you look at most of the older data centers, you know, they struggle to cool 10 kilowatts a cabinet, let alone 100 kilowatts, right? So it's a massive challenge for people who are looking to implement and put Gen AI infrastructures in place, because they now need to go out to the market or they need to look at their on-prem. So if existing DCs are constrained by accessibility to the local grid connections and or the grid capacity, where will the next generation of data centers get their power from? So you could build in countries or areas where it has plenty of power, right? Now, if you look at the Nordics, Poland, many secondary tier markets, they have huge potential because they have huge amounts of power. But Poland in particular is a bit of a problem because, you know, it's got a power generation, its power plants are based on lignite, which is the worst kind of coal. So you're not going to do your Scope 3 emissions any favors if you go to Poland. But if you want a data center at any cost, that's a great place to go. And a lot of the smaller countries outside of Flat D, which is Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Paris, and Dublin, they don't necessarily have the connectivity and technical resources that those more established centers have. You could build your own substation, right? A lot of constraint on the national grid is not necessarily a power constraint, it's actually a connectivity constraint. So the power exists in the national grid, but you can't get the connectivity to it. And a lot of the reason for that is that the smaller substations, the 10, 20 megawatt substations, have full capacity, and it takes a long time for national grids to build out those substations. But they probably have a 100 megawatt substation you can connect to. You might have to take it quite a way. For instance, in Amsterdam, they have loads of capacity at the 100 megawatt level, but they have very little capacity at the lower levels. But you're going to have to build your own substation on site in order to connect into it. So it does take a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. You've got to traverse a lot of permitting in terms of trying to get those kinds of routes out to where you need to get the power from. But yeah, you can build your own substation. You could have on-site generation. I think gas was talked about at the beginning of the day. Nuclear, combined heat and power, CHP. So that's one way of getting around it. You build your own energy generation. It's yours. You don't need to rely on the grid anymore. Or if you want to go for the truly renewable option, which essentially is waiting for the grid to green. You can wait for the government to do that, but that could be some time. Now, so we talked about going to countries like Poland, which obviously isn't going to do your emissions any good. You could go for renewable power, but there are all kinds of issues around renewable power. Because if you put a wind farm, if you install a wind farm for the grid, you've also got to have a stable supply of power that you've also got to build out to make sure that when the wind doesn't blow, or if you use solar when the sun doesn't shine, that you can keep the grid inertia running. Okay. But the unfortunate thing, that energy storage capacity, for just that case, when you've got energy that you're creating with renewables you can't use, just isn't in place, and it's horrendously expensive. Now, things are changing, but they're changing very slowly. So, for instance, there's been a lot of controversy in Scotland, where a lot of the wind farms that are off-site, off-land, they've had to be switched off, and when they switch them off, the government has to pay the wind farm owners to switch them off. All right, so we're paying for electricity we don't generate. Kind of crazy, right? So the answer to that is to have lots of energy storage, because you can't transmit it down to the south where all the energy is required. And there's a bit of a contradiction in place with the governments, because the governments are trying to encourage you all to digitize, right, in the digitization agenda. But then they get upset when you build a data center that wants a lot of power. Well, you can't have it both ways, I'd say that on balance of it, perhaps this government is a little bit better in that regard. They don't do much right, but they seem to be doing a lot better in encouraging people to build data centers, but we do need to get this energy mix right. And data centers aren't really seen as high employers. There's a lot of construction activity, and places like Ireland have really benefited from the huge amount of data center construction that's taken place. They've got highly skilled, engineers who, due to network effects, they've got a lot of work, and they're building a lot of data centers. Even though they're not building so many data centers in Ireland now, they can export that expertise out to other countries. So there are advantages to data centers, but you're not going to see a huge amount of high employment in the local area. And there has been some talk about nuclear earlier today, and so we've got the small modular reactors. We've got the AMRs and the MNRs. MNRs are the micronuclear reactors, by the way. They're the tiny ones. I'll talk about those in a second. Not really commercialized sufficiently. They've got some commercial prototypes out, but there's a lot of issues around permitting and regulation that the governments need to sort. Unfortunately, a lot of this is in the government's hands. So that first one is something I end up saying a lot of when I sit in a room full of engineers, right? Is you've got to remember that data centers are built to house IT. Right? It's not Field of Dreams. We don't build a data center and hope that the IT comes. Right? We have to build the data center around what the IT is that's going to go in that data center. And it's easy to forget that. So in terms of Gen AI, data needs to be close to the compute. There's very high-speed networking that needs to be there. The power delivery, particularly for the high-end NVIDIA GPUs, it's phenomenal. And it's how do you get that power to those cabinets? And the cable thickness is crazy, right? The cooling technologies, air doesn't cut it anymore. That's why NVIDIA's new Rubin chip uses on-chip cooling. So that's because there's no way of getting those kinds of heats out of the cabinet. And I don't think, number 6 there, I don't think it's going to be politically possible. If you've got a Gen AI data center running Rubin chips, expelling all that hot air out into the atmosphere. So we need to think about how do we reuse that heat. And there's already, in Germany, they're already regulated for that with new data centers. A lot of people forget that the cabinet loads, all right, 3 tons, up to 3 tons for a cabinet. There's a lot of data centers, particularly existing data centers, and with raised floors, you're not going to get a 3-ton cabinet into that. Right? It's just not going to happen. So they have to build specifically to support those kinds of loads. And new compute technologies, they move, the chip technology is moving on all the time. Okay. So this always makes me laugh because I feel like NVIDIA in some ways are driving data center technologies rather than the other way around, right? If you think about it, if you're building a commercial data center and you're trying to attract different types of customers, but you have to provide support for a single super chip, which is 2,700 watts, and you could have, what, 10 of those in a cabinet, maybe 20, right? That technology only supports those NVIDIA configurations. It's not going to work for the rest of your data center. There's issues around these faster data speeds because the wires heat up. The faster you push data down them, the higher the temperatures of the cabling. The cabling then creates greater resistance, and therefore it slows down your data speeds. So you're kind of caught in a bit of a trap there. Now, there's a lot of work going into photonics. Photonics is becoming a much more commercialized product. It's becoming cheaper to convert from digital to light and back again. And that's potentially why I see that a lot of the innovation is going to come. And there's a very interesting thing about glass. So you may be unaware that the way that light passes through glass uses exactly the same maths as that employed by AI chips for inferencing. And there have been, obviously, tests done in labs that allows, they can etch the circuits in glass and provide AI inferencing at a fraction of the energy demand of a GPU chip. So keep an eye on that one, folks, because that's going to really change the data center impact. So in order to do this presentation, I kind of did a bit of a pest analysis, if you're not familiar with it, political, economic, social, and technology. So in terms of data center owners, they need to try and keep themselves under the radar, but unfortunately that's not a case anymore. You know, they can't hide anymore. The EU has already legislated. Germany has taken it further with the requirement for heat reuse for new data centers. So the regulators are already infringing on us. And personally, I think it's a good thing. You may disagree if you own a data center, but I think there's been such a lack of transparency in terms of what data centers consume and why they consume it, that we do need to open a window on that. Where are the jobs? We've discussed this, you know, are there really lots of jobs? Well, the cluster effect says that we are going to generate a lot of high-tech employment. So, AI is going to be used for technological advancement. Who knows where that's going to go, right? The opportunity is huge. Unfortunately, though, we need to think about the environment. A lot of the large companies like Microsoft made commitments that they were going to go net zero by 2030. Well, interestingly, they've increased their energy use by more than 30% in the last few years alone, which means that they are getting further and further away from net zero, but they won't admit it yet. And it's the same with AWS. They won't admit that they can't meet net zero demands. Google also are struggling. No large hyperscaler can meet net zero. It's just not possible. So what you're going to see is you're going to see a huge re-benchmarking where they're going to say, oh no, now we want to do it in 2050 or something. You know, they're going to have to come. They're going to have to be transparent and honest at some point. And I really don't like this carbon-free claims that they have. A lot of them using offsets. Offsets are not the way to become carbon-free, because it's all very well you paying for instance, let's say pay for renewables in Scotland, as we've already discussed, right? Scotland's got plenty of renewables, we just can't use them. And anyway, if you wanted to connect them to the grid, there's a 20 to 30 year lag in getting connectivity to the grid. So what's the point of that? Well, if it's easy in your conscience, fine, but that's not the way to become carbon-free. And there's various other devices such as PPAs and virtual PPAs, renewable energy certificates, carbon offsets. So we talked about that. So because the data center providers are worried that the governments, if they really knew the true scale of what they consume, would start to intervene, there's a large incentive for them to actually be very quiet about it. So the really only way for us to be sustainable within data centers is to have a green grid to draw power from. And that's going to take government action. And if we want to talk about nuclear, which, by the way, has the lowest morbidity rate out of all the energy sources that provide electricity to us, I mean, coal is the worst by a long shot. Nuclear gives you a stable base load. It's perfect for data centers. And it's got a low morbidity rate. And you know what? Nuclear is not as bad as they would tell you. But we need governments to have a campaign to inform the general populace, because people don't want data centers with nuclear power stations in their region or in their neighborhood. How many of you know that there's a nuclear reactor in the middle of Birmingham? Anyone know that? No. And why should you? Because it doesn't present any kind of risk to you. It's not going to affect you. You can live side by side with nuclear reactors, the smaller ones certainly, much more so even than the larger ones. Right? But people don't know that. There's a lot of ignorance in terms of radiation, because we're scared, because we hear about things like Chernobyl, we hear about things like 5 Mile Island. These things scare us, so we don't want any nuclear at all. Germany switched off all its nuclear power stations because of the tsunami in Japan, in Fukushima, right? And now they're desperately trying to work out how they can turn nuclear back on. But this last thing is what I'm really interested in, because there is a Landau principle. Okay, he was a physicist, and he looked at the use of electricity in electronics, and he said that 99.97% of the electricity that goes into a data center comes out as waste heat. So let me just emphasize that, let you absorb it. 99.97% of the electricity that goes into a data center comes out as waste heat. So are we really consuming energy? Or are we just in the way of the energy path? If we'd like to think of ourselves as energy suppliers rather than energy demand, energy consumers, then you start to think of things differently. You start to look at how we can pass energy into the local communities. So I want to lead you with that thought that that we can redefine what it means to be a data center, okay? And the impact on the data center, it needs to be, the data centers need to be flexible, need to be able to cope with all different types of IT that go into them. And so we don't get caught with our, we don't lose our shirt, shall we say. If we build data centers for NVIDIA, Rubin chips, and tomorrow glass-etched inferencing comes out, we're not left with a huge power capacity asset that we can't use. So, but if we're providing benefit to the local environment and local region, then I think we improve the public perception of what it actually means to be a data center owner operator. So that's it. Thank you very much. Have we got time for? All right, we can take 2 questions.
Thanks. Stephen, I thought your presentation was fantastic. I'm Paul, I'm from PwC. You talked a lot about energy consumption, of course, of data centers. You even talked about data centers as suppliers of heat energy. Thinking about the other side of the climate coin, we also hear that data centers are also very vulnerable to climate change. And I wondered what you thought the strategic and commercial implications of a warming world for the data centers that are getting built at the moment might be.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, obviously, when you look at the cooling, a lot of the progress towards environmentally sustainable cooling has been around free cooling, where we're taking the difference between what the external ambient temperatures are and being able to use that to cool down or to extract the heat, shall we say, more accurately, extract the heat from the data center so we can provide cool air without turning on the compressors. And obviously, if the climate gets warmer, then that makes it more difficult because you have less free cooling. And we don't want to be adding, as I said earlier, we don't want to be adding to the problem by expelling all of this hot air. I mean, I can imagine, I don't know what a heat map of Slough looks like, but I can imagine that it looks pretty bad. A lot of people realized that Elon was taking liberties with his generators out in the desert out in the US because he had turned them all on and they could see heat maps of all these generators running, against the environmental regulations that are in place in the US. So we need to be responsible operators, and we need to realize that we don't want to become part of the problem, we want to become part of the solution. And if we can find a way of using less energy to provide the same kind of digital services, that's surely the best way of being able to prove that. But don't get me wrong though, we're by no means the largest energy user of all the industries. Have a look at steel smelting, have a look at super hospitals. There are plenty of industries out there that use far more electricity than we do, but we get a lot of stick because we're new, and we haven't quite defined what our role is yet, and been able to talk about that honestly with people who are concerned about it. Thank you. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much for your time today. I hope it's been of interest.